Welcome back to Fresh Economic Thinking. Today, a special guest, David Maywald, who's just written a book, The Relentless War on Masculinity. Does it ever end? Here's a look at that book. David, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here with you, Cameron.
Look, one of my topics of interest is the disconnect between the public conversation about a topic and the data or the reality. And this is one of those examples, the gender war, et cetera, et cetera. I want to know how you came to this topic, David, and to such a degree that you decided to write a book and put war in the title. How does one begin approaching the topic of masculinity? How do you get in? Thanks.
That is a big question.
Yeah,
We'll
where
try
to
to break it
start?
down into parts. So, I'm a proud 49-year-old white Aussie male, father, husband. I embrace, my role as a father and husband. I think they're two of the most important things that I do in my life. When I was finishing school, and starting university, 35 years ago, I was really fascinated by some of the dynamics going on that were really empowering, accelerating girls and young women. I was watching girls come up through high school and get fantastic results, go into a whole range of different courses with lots of scholarships and support, both cultural support and institutional support. And I tracked that over the last 3 decades. I've been watching those schooling and university results, and it's going in one direction. The last year of data, there was 64% more female graduates than male graduates coming out of our higher education system. And that's heading
Wow.
towards 2 to 1, which is really deeply imbalanced and unhealthy in my perspective. We've gone from what was a very male-leaning, androcentric education system and society, but now we've just gone way through equality. We've gone way to extremes, and neither of those extremes are healthy. When my son and daughter were born 7 and 8 years ago, it really made me think about the world that they were going to live in the decades to come. And I don't think it's going to be healthy if everything is optimized in favor of my son and his cohort, or in favor of my daughter and her cohort. And I was in the unique position where I could sort of publicly speak about this and write about this, and actually felt an obligation to put it on the record.
Wow. I think we must be like-minded because when we see a topic and we think there's some injustice or unfairness or perceived disconnect between the reality and the public conversation, we feel obliged to say something. So I definitely feel that connection. I want to get into some of the details, but perhaps a better question might be, how would you respond to someone who said, yeah, well, men had it better for so long. So a short period where maybe things are too much in favor with women is okay. It's okay that women are, going to be 2 to 1 at university for a couple of decades because that makes up for lost time in terms of gender equality. How would you respond to that critique?
Firstly, I think it fundamentally misunderstands human history because
Okay.
for all of human history, men have died younger. And for across the whole sweep of humanity, females have been twice as likely to have offspring as males. And if you think about
Mm.
what it means to have lived a life, to have a legacy, to live longer and to actually have children are two pretty fundamental outcomes of being a human. There's about half of all males are estimated to have had offspring throughout humanity, whereas about 80 to 90% of females are estimated to have had offspring. And consistently, males have died sooner, often because they've worked the most dangerous jobs, they've gone to war, they've put their own lives on the line to sacrifice and save and protect their families and their communities. So to say that for all of humanity until now, men as a group have oppressed women as a group is complete bullshit. It's not the case. In fact, all societies have been marked by male disposability, which means putting a lower moral weight onto boys and men's lives and sacrificing them for the sake of their communities. So I think fundamentally that question is biased and it's a misunderstanding and a misreading of human history. But to think about the current generation, boys, young men, if you're blaming them, if you're casting them as patriarchal, evil oppressors, again, it's complete bullshit because they haven't had any of those benefits. So you might identify some benefits that those boys' great great grandfathers had going
Mm.
back in history. And they might relate to access to some types of education, access to some types of career, earning more money, and other things like that. They also sacrificed, by the way. They
Mm.
sacrificed time with their family. They sacrificed time on things they would rather have been doing. Many of them died involuntarily, including through conscription. So if you're going to blame like a 10-year-old boy or a 16-year-old boy or a 21-year-old young man, blame him for things that never benefited him and disadvantage him in this current era, well, of course you're going to breed resentment.
Mm.
That it fundamentally is an immoral stance to take, and it doesn't work. It's actually counterproductive to have that opinion and to try and enforce that on boys and young men.
Well, I want to dig in a little bit more to the consequences of this, maybe the last 20 years of we've had, I've been outspoken against wokeness and things like that, but a real gender bias in favor of women, despite the data showing women already being very successful at most of the things that they're getting advantages in. So I guess what I want to sort of go through are a list of ways where boys and men are being left behind or where things have gone too far. So you've mentioned that women live longer. And I know in the book, I'm just going to find the chart because it was quite memorable. Something like 5 years longer women live on average. Is that right?
Mm.
It peaked around 7 years longer in the 70s.
Yeah.
Uh, so they live 5 years longer. They're more likely to have children. And we also know, as you've suggested, and I've interviewed James Nuzzo before, and you've used some of the data in his book, that since the 1980s, women have been more likely to get a university degree than men. So that's three things. Are there others, indicators or metrics that show your argument that, maybe in the last 25 years, in this century, boys are really being left behind in important parts of life?
The education system isn't serving boys and young men. The
Uh-huh.
changes here started going back to the 60s and 70s, including with mass rewriting of textbooks and with literature and other materials to try and re-engineer to condition schools as an environment to empower girls and young women. And what that took away was the content and the inspiration and the material to uplift boys. You see, even you see in the early years of schooling an emphasis on literacy, on pre-literacy, on early reading and early writing, which can actually be counterproductive for some boys who aren't developmentally ready for that. Some countries delay that until more like 8 years old. But if you think about a boy and a girl who are both 5 years old, the chances are that they're going to be slightly different in terms of their cognitive development. And so, in general, the girls of that age, 4, 5, 6, they might lean into starting to read, taking an interest in books, seeing it as a strength. Whereas the chances are that boys of the same chronological age are going to be slightly different in their development. They might have more spatial capacity, they might have more energy and physicality. So they might be advanced in those areas, but they might not be as advanced in some of the cognitive development and interest in literacy. So if the boys see quite a few of the girls in that same group flocking to that and really good at that and enjoying that and doing well at that and being praised by their female educator or their female teacher because of their fluency in doing that, those boys might feel that they're inadequate or that that's not their strength or they are not good at that. And unfortunately, it can set some boys off not finding a love of reading, not engaging in literacy because they feel inadequate or because the way that it's being presented and the content that's being presented doesn't appeal to them. So I think there is a risk there that from the very start of schooling, because by year nine, boys are a year and a half behind in literacy, which is a huge gap. And then
Yeah.
at the end of high school, there's a massive gap in terms of high school completion and whether boys are still engaged to the same level that girls are.
Wow. So you think the education gap is not just a university thing. Boys still just want to go into trades and do things with their hands and don't want to sit around in books all day. Um, you think that the education system from grade one is essentially structured towards advantaging women, females, and their learning style against the boys and the more active physical hands-on play. I know you do mention this a couple of times, and it's come to my attention. I've got two boys. One just finished high school, so I've had the full experience. And I remember at primary school, we had to run around the school as many times as we could between 8:30 and 9 and just get it all out of our system. And I actually had four male teachers in primary school, so majority male teachers. And they would sense when the class is restless and we'd go down the oval and we'd play whatever, dodgeball or tunnel ball or whatever the thing was, just for 20 minutes, just to get sweaty and stuff and come back. Um, what's your thoughts on single sex schools then? Do you think there's still some advantage in that? Were they a legacy of some kind of learnt wisdom or insight that a boys' school can function just for boys? We don't and structure its activities, or what do you make of the single sex school as, I guess, the choice of parents to do that still as a solution to this inequality in the type of teaching?
If you think about the culture that's likely to develop in a all boys school compared to an all girls school, it's more likely to cherish the innate strengths, accept the behaviors, to work with the material. Whereas in co-ed, particularly government schools, what we've fallen into is a gynocentric um, approach, both culturally, in terms of the staff, in terms of the curriculum, all aspects of those schools, of the system and the institutions have shifted towards gynocentrism within the space of the last 5 decades. And unfortunately, in some cases, it fundamentally doesn't accept the material of the boys that are present in those schools. And
Mm,
that that's really tragic for those boys and those families. Um, we've obviously spoken to many other parents and teachers and administrators about the choices that families make to go all girls or all boys or co-ed. There are a lot of different reasons for doing that. Um, some could be academic, some could be social, others could be about relational, lots of different reasons. I think it's important for there to be choice. And one interesting asymmetry that you see in Australia is the huge amount of pressure from all areas of society for all boys' schools to go co-ed, but virtually no
mm,
pressure for all girls' schools to go co-ed. Why? Why is that? Why do parents, teachers, education systems, media, politicians, why do they drop a ton of bricks on virtually every all boys school to force them to change? Because
mm,
those schools cherish and nurture and they understand innate masculinity. They shape beautiful, outstanding young men. They're important institutions, they're important choices and options for families to have.
mm. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, I went to an all boys school and I could, and it's really interesting. My sons go to a co-ed state school. Um, and you see there's usually like one female school captain, one male school captain and whatnot. And we went to the graduation and the speeches and like completely different. It's like the female school captain lived in a different world, had a completely different experience to the male school captain when they reflected on it. And I was in shock. I'm like, wow, this is so the contrast of what they valued, how they perceived things. It was just like, you know, someone going to school in China 100 years ago and someone living on the moon. Like it was, I couldn't have imagined more different perceptions. And yeah, that was a big insight. So I want to get on to one of the key things in your book, David, which is this four horsemen, which is your attempt at categorizing the way society changes. But I had this question written down, and it I've read somewhere that we're still fighting the battles of 50 years ago. We have a lot of old men who are in charge of many things, or institutions and politically, who think we're fighting the gender battles of the 1960s and 70s when they grew up. What what would you say to them to convince them that it's different now? It's not, the boys don't have this fast track to a high paying job, etc. The women they meet aren't keen to be housewives and do things this way, that things have changed. What do you say to these old guys? Have you had such conversations?
It's interesting in the Lost Generation essay by Jacob Savage that he turns on some of those older men. He
Okay,
turns on
so this
the
essay was in Compact magazine, is that
Compact
right?
magazine just
In
before
2020.
Christmas.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yep.
And Jacob himself is a millennial white male um, who who documents how he's missed out on opportunities that he saw routinely going to women of his same age, to ethnic racial minorities and others of his same age. And it got an incredible response. It was shared virally. It had many other men of similar age sharing their personal experiences of feeling that they missed out in terms of work, maybe education, in terms of relationships, forming a relationship, possibly starting a family, that they didn't have the same type of promotions and income opportunities that they otherwise would have had. He turns on older men. And that's the first time I really thought about it clearly, that the men towards the top of some of those organizations, they sandbag their own privilege, but they dumped on
Mm.
men who were 20, 30, 40 years younger than them for the sake of holding on to their own personal benefits and the positions that they had, including status, including having a voice, an outsized voice. They carved out a whole range of opportunities for men in their 20s and 30s. And it's a really interesting perspective. And it obviously comes from a place of feeling significantly aggrieved, Jacob in his writing, and the many other comments that have come through since the article in December. It's an interesting perspective, I think. And
Yeah.
one thing I think that's missing is uh, educating themselves. For those older men, they went through education systems and junior roles in the middle of organizations in a completely different era. So in the United States, women outnumbered men at colleges in 1982, and in Australian universities, women outnumbered men at Australian universities in 1987. That's 4 decades ago. That's, in some families, that's 2 generations. In others, it's more like 1.5 generations. I don't think those older men understand just how um, unfriendly and ineffective our education system is for boys and young men. I don't think they understand that there are 64% more female graduates than male graduates. I don't think they comprehend that young women are earning more per hour than young men. I
Mm.
think they need to be educated in what the actual situation is now, not what the situation was 40 years ago.
Yeah, very interesting. Um, yeah, I definitely perceive that generational gap. And what's really interesting is some of the data you put in the book. There was a survey last year about traditional attitudes of male and female roles in Australia that found that over 65 men out of the men had the most traditional views about the role of men and women in society. But the second group of men, second most traditional, were 15 to 24-year-olds. Do you sense this is like the pendulum swinging back of these boys realizing this, the nonsense they've dealt with at school? Um, do you have any insight into the cause of that, or have you done any further research?
So that's based on Hilda data. It's based on
Uh-huh.
responses to 7 questions in the Hilda survey, which, as you know, is a very widely cited and
Yes.
used source of
So
data on
the Hilda
Australian
survey
society.
is like a household survey, very detailed one. How many people are in it? About 8,000 a year, and it tracks people for a particular, like 5 years. They do it each year, and then each year they get new people into the survey. It's Australia's most comprehensive household survey.
So if you think about those different cohorts of males, what that particular analysis was showing was that those younger males, 15 to 24 years old, are much closer to their grandfathers in terms of views on those 7 questions than they are to their fathers. So in a sense,
Yeah.
the grandfathers, the boomers, have sort of clung on to some of their views about families, about roles for men and women, about innate masculinity and innate femininity. In some ways, they, and older women too, they value the dance of masculine and feminine. They value the complementarity between what mothers and fathers bring to parenting and what men and women bring
Mm.
to society. And they're quite comfortable, those older men and women, grandmothers and grandfathers, they're quite comfortable that men and women are different. Now, one of the really perverse, weird aspects of the waves of feminism was this attempt to obliterate sexual differences, this goal of having androgyny, of dissolving the differences, of trying to argue that mothers and fathers are exactly the same, that men and women should do things that are exactly the same. It was an extreme version of equality of outcomes, but it was always destined to fail because it had a fundamental misconception of biology, of physiology, of hormones, of human behavior, and the history of all of humanity. That's captured in the great religious texts. It's captured in the traditional concepts about family and parenting that are so valuable. I think what has happened is that feminism tried to push some of these extreme views. Millennials maybe went along with that to quite a big degree, but Gen Z males in particular are calling BS on it. They're not going along with it. You know, they have seen in their lives just how much discrimination there is and denigration there is towards males, towards their fathers, towards their brothers, towards their friends. And they're just saying it's gone too far. It doesn't make sense. It's not getting good social outcomes. We're going to look towards something that did work before, that
Yeah.
worked for centuries, that actually was pro-social, and we're not going to go along with this propaganda anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. Let me reflect on that from my experience. So I've had some comments. So I'm born in 82, oldest millennial. And I've had a few of my mates almost turn as they get older and realize, so a few divorces, um, people realize that the courts just cannot give dads a chance in family court. It's just literally, women have this all stitched up. And I know there's a movement about that, um, the court's really not willing to put their foot down for fairness when it comes to the father's side of things. And then there's also a lot of I've had people weirdly acknowledge like, oh, so and so, she's a woman, so it's not like she's actually responsible for her work. She's, we just had to employ her. Like casual comments about the corporate environment where literally it's like, well, we have to create these fake jobs for women, but I'm actually still responsible for the outcomes. And it was a shock to me because, I'm the age group that grew up with the pure, like we're all equal and all fair, um, to now sense that amongst my peer group and even myself, noticing that I don't get what's fair about this. I'm still the guy who's responsible at work. I'm still the guy who's responsible for paying for my children when my wife basically drains my bank account, takes me to the cleaners, and whose lawyer keeps putting all these hoops in front of me. So I can definitely sense a shift over time, even amongst the millennial group, which is quite interesting. But I want to move on to, in your book, the Four Horsemen. This is your attempt to sort of structure the changes that have taken place around gender roles in society. What are they? And let's get through some examples because I thought that was the best chapter in the book.
Thank you. And in it has had a lot of good feedback across a wide range of different types of readers. So what you're talking about is chapter 3 in The Relentless War on
Mm,
Masculinity. And the chapter's titled The Four Horsewomen of Modern Feminism. And the chapter goes through these four examples: misandry, gamma bias, gynocentrism, and gaslighting.
mhm.
And what the chapter does is takes quite recent examples, in a lot of cases, of how each of these four are being practiced in society, in education, in media, in public policy. Um, for misandry, I actually go back to one of the classic academic texts from 2001, which is by Nathanson and Young. And they examined media and entertainment industries in the 1990s, and they found a
Mm,
ton of examples of hatred and contempt of males in the 1990s. So these four horsewomen, they're not new phenomena. They're not just just the practices of extreme feminists. Gynocentrism is often practiced by males. It's often practiced
yeah.
by male CEOs, by male prime ministers. Gaslighting, you see this across the whole spectrum. So these aren't the domain only of um, feminists, of women, of others. These four can be practiced by anyone.
So
And
let
the reason that I specifically called them out, I wanted to put a name, I wanted to clearly explain what they are, and I want people to see these four every day because I see them every day.
mm. So let's go through. Yeah, I definitely think that's the power of classifying and identifying this stuff is now it's in your mind. So when you see it, you notice and you're like, oh, that's an example of what David was talking about. So Miss Andre, you write, is the hatred of men or the systemic contempt for men, much more than subtle discrimination. The double standards of public discourse around being able to say kill all men being acceptable or as satire versus women belong in the kitchen being unacceptable. Like, I,
So
you know,
think about that. So one of those things is saying kill all men, which is quite an incitement. It's got a
yeah,
lot of hate in there. The other statement is women belong in the kitchen, which is like, yeah, a lot of people don't like when they hear that. But it's not saying kill all women. It's a comment about specialization and bifurcation and
yeah.
roles in terms of having a household and raising families. And I point to those two specifically because kill or men has just been amplified and accepted. It hasn't been clamped down on. You see on
Mm,
Google Trends, it's going up. It's becoming more prevalent. Whereas some of these other quite benign uh, sayings or
yeah,
expressions do get clamped down on across the board by workplaces, by media, by so-called thought leaders.
yeah,
So there's a big difference there. And the other aspect which is interesting is that there's a huge propaganda campaign to try and overemphasize misogyny, like to try and
Right.
identify that in every aspect of life, like to try and find it where it's not there. But actually, when you do the objective observation, there is misogyny and there's a lot of misandry as well. And we
Mm.
need to identify both. Neither of them are healthy, particularly when they're extreme. We need to call out both. But in particular, what we've been missing because of the gynocentrism, we've been missing the misandry. We've let that grow and fester and propagate and amplify to the point now where it's really harmful. It's harmful, particularly for boys and young men, because what they see is that this has been normalized.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that got me, I grew up in the Simpsons era, right? And the Simpsons, for the young listeners out there, is the longest running cartoon that sort of kicked off in the early 90s. But the whole premise of that is there's this deadbeat dad who got lucky, fell into this union job and earned enough for his family, just like lucked out the whole way, but was completely useless. And actually, I've seen studies, you mentioned some in the book, um, going through all those 90s sitcoms and whatnot, and very few competent, able, sensible dads. Everyone's the deadbeat dad, whether it's Married with Children or The Simpsons or, you know, it's pretty much not in the repertoire of sitcoms to have competent, faithful, loyal dad who's it's so rare. And can you imagine if the sitcoms were where Marge, the wives were the dithering idiots who lucked out into things? It would just be chaos. Imagine if Netflix came out with that, right? It would send the company broke. It would be the biggest outcry. So
The
I
change,
that tickled my fancy because, The Simpsons basically became the Homer Simpson is a doofus who lucked out because he's a white dude. That's basically the premise of the whole show for 30 years. It's
but
weird, huh?
change Peppa Pig, change Bluey. That would make people uncomfortable
Oh, yeah.
because, I know a lot of dads who really don't like Peppa Pig. The dads who've got toddlers, younger kids. It's just stereotypical. It's the same type of lower level misandry. It,
Right.
it's it's really denigrating. It's really discomforting to expose kids to that from the very youngest age, from babies and toddlers, to expose them to those stereotypes is really harmful. Um, I
Wow.
haven't seen many people call out Bluey, but if you carefully looked at it through a lens of symmetry and gender bias, you can pick up those things. You often
My
see
kids are
the
too
mother
old for
coming in.
Bluey, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I don't know it. I mean, I know it's based in Brisbane, so you know, I'm from Brisbane. Okay, so that's Miss
So
Andrew. Is there anything else you want to add to that before we get onto the gamma bias, horsewoman number two, maybe? So gamma bias is, I'm going to quote from your book here, the psychological tendency to interpret male and female behavior through different lenses. A man who asserts himself is labeled aggressive, while a woman doing the same is praised as confident. A mother who works long hours is celebrated for her ambition, while a father who does so is criticized for neglecting his family. These double standards appear in research, media coverage, and education policy. I have noticed now that I've read it, I notice it. What got you to notice this first? What was the thing that stood out?
I saw an article by Martin Seeger and John Barry, and I watched a YouTube video where they had explained this. It's sort of like a hypothesis. It's a hypothesis and a prompt to encourage people to observe behaviors. Um, there is a asymmetry. There's also a maximization and a minimization. So where there's a choice of amplifying something that's positive for females, the hypothesis would be that good tendency does get amplified and projected, whereas when there's something positive for the male protagonist, it gets minimized or diminished. And so it can be objectively measured and observed. And the really fascinating aspect of this is for the party who's making that judgment, can they make the assertion before they know the sex of the protagonist? That's the
Mm,
key point here. If you treat everyone the same, if you're genuinely colorblind and you're not making these biased projections onto other people, then you don't need to know the sex of the protagonist.
mm,
And that's what makes it really tricky. And this is where it does help to push back against identity politics, against the stereotypes and the group bias, because what it's clearly saying that there are groups of people who make these projections knowing the sex of the protagonist and that they are systematically biased in that
mm,
direction. And there's the test here. If you objectively have symmetry about how you um, interpret or project or uh, put meaning onto these
mm,
situations, if you have genuine symmetry, then you don't have gamma bias. If
mm,
you systematically have a big asymmetry, which consistently undermines males and uplifts females, what this hypothesis is saying is that you have a large amount of gamma bias. And so it does help us to interpret our own behavior, but it also helps us to observe and measure and
yeah.
identify behavior in other people. That's why it's so powerful.
Yeah, I like it. I actually wrote an article on fresh economic thinking a year or two ago. And I said, doesn't matter if women earn less than men because there are people live in households, and within households, if men earn more, then they give women money without having to work, their wives and their daughters, right? And I looked shows some research showing how much the typical male transfers to members of his household over a lifetime. And people got really upset. They're like, oh, woman's dependent on a man. That's different, blah, 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 blah. And I just thought exactly as you did. What if we didn't know? What if this was women just giving men money, giving husbands money for just being husbands and living in the same household? Like the reaction would have been radically, radically different because when a man does it, the woman's dependent. And what if he's an abuser and this and that? But if it's the other way, if I'm the husband of a supermodel who's earning all the money, people be like, oh, he's so lucky that he can do that, isn't he great? And I'm like, is it all word games? Like, does sometimes you get to the point where no one actually cares. They just want to say words that feel good. And currently what feels good in their culture is putting women on a pedestal, interpreting everything in their favor. Have you ever just thought it's just no one actually means it? Or is that part of your point that we don't actually mean it? It's just a bias in the culture, which is bad for people growing up in the culture. And
What I try to identify is the socially harmful implications and outcomes
uh-huh.
of having that inconsistency of the double standards. To be honest, I don't think most people will recognize each of these four horsewomen in 5 years' time. But what they will understand is double standards
Mm,
because they know that. That's a pub test, right? They can see when there's clearly different. And I think there are a number of aspects here that socially it's had bad outcomes. For example, many more children are fatherless now than they were 40, 50, 60 years ago.
mhm.
And they need, particularly boys, need their fathers to be actively involved to navigate adolescence, to become good, decent contributors to society. They need fathers and other males to be really closely involved. Think about young women and their behavior. There's a lot of abusive behavior from girls and young women, a huge amount. In fact, it's measured, it's been measured and measurable. And in some cases, there's more abuse being perpetrated by girls and young women than perpetrated by boys and young men of the same age cohort. So you've got, in some bad outcomes, entitlement. You've got feelings of superiority, moral superiority. that because they are female, they are morally more important and superior and more worthy than the same person who happens to be of a different biological sex. So there are any number of different social outcomes that are bad for boys, men, girls, women, families, communities. We can
Yeah.
measure those, and that's where it becomes something that is worthy of culture change and public policy.
Yeah. I'm totally with you. I'm going to give you another example of gamma bias. I think it's gamma bias. Look, we'll get to the other horse, women, in a moment. Um, Last year, the federal government wrote off 20% of everybody's HECS debts, their higher education loan debts. And we know that women are the majority of graduates for the last 40 years, but we also know that women graduates repay their HECS debts slower. They have breaks to have children, et cetera, before they've repaid their debts. So most of the debt is for women who've been to university and who haven't earned much money for whatever reason, um, their choice, you know. And I've just Googled HECS write-off favors women, which it does, right? Because the dollars are there. The AI result says the assertion that a HECS write-off favors women is inaccurate based on recent policy analysis. In fact, recent changes have been criticized for potentially favoring higher income earners. Past HECS policies have a disproportionate negative impact on women. And I'm just sitting here in shock that essentially writing off more debts for women than men is summarized by AI, which summarizes all the writing of our culture about this topic as being the opposite. Now, that isn't that interpreting a simple fact through a biased lens? Like if it was men, if it was the opposite, right?
Mm.
If men were 60, 70% more likely to go to university and had 2/3 of the debt instead of, rather than 50-50, we know, everybody knows that, of course, the Google AI will tell me, oh, yeah, this is in favor of men, writing off all these men's debts. What about the women? Crazy, isn't it? Anyway, I'm seeing it everywhere now, David.
Our
Um,
media is gynocentric. There's an infamous photograph from the editors' meeting at the Huffington Post in 2016, and it's sort of it's framed as in celebrating the diversity that the editors were really diverse now. But if you look closely at the picture, they're all white women.
hmm,
What it was celebrating was that, you know, 40 years ago, that room might have been all white men. Maybe there could have been some women in that room. But what it was sort of celebrating was there being this change. But it's not really much better. You go from only being white men to only being white women. That's not diverse. It's equally
yeah,
not representative. And unfortunately, because AI is trawling through the publicly available content, a lot of it media generated, you've got gynocentric mainstream media in Australia, and it's pumping out this constant stream of pro-female interpretations and narratives and framing of information.
yeah, I find it odd. So the third horsewoman is called gynocentrism. And I'm going to quote your book, Gynocentrism. I can't even speak. Must have been my education. Tried to learn to read too early. Refers to societies that focus on women are primarily concerned with female perspectives and interests and take a feminine point of view. The opposite of gynocentric is androcentric, having a male worldview. Gynocentrism goes beyond empathy for women. It elevates women's concerns as inherently more urgent and morally more important than men's. For all health campaigns focused almost exclusively on women's issues to government funding skewed heavily toward female recipients, the message is clear: women's needs come first.
And nowhere in that description does it mention that women are in positions of power. A gynocentric organization and a gynocentric society can still be all male in terms of its leadership
Mm,
composition. And that is the case in Australia. We have had a female Prime Minister. Julia Gillard was Prime Minister
mm,
for 3 years. But for the last, what, since 2007 or so, I would say all those federal governments have been gynocentric. even though all bar one of the prime ministers has been male. So you don't need to have a female CEO and a female executive or a female cabinet to be a gynocentric organization or to lead a gynocentric society. The Family Law Act and no fault divorce passed about 50 years ago. Do you know the governor who signed no fault divorce into operation in the America?
Oh, some
It was
bloke.
Ronald Reagan in
Yeah.
California, the esteemed Republican president of 8 years. So a man who was a Republican signed that legislation into
And
implementation.
are you also note saying that you think that was a bad idea, or just it's an example of the switch in the culture?
Well, it has had implications for family stability, for fatherlessness, for boys not having the guidance, the masculine involvement in their lives that they need to transition through adolescence. So
Yeah,
I'm not saying, I mean,
I can.
there are various changes that can be made
Yeah.
to have more balance and fairness in terms of relationships. Um, I mean,
So I
rolling
think,
back that is a very big reform that isn't getting majority support in our societies.
yeah, your point you make about biased family courts, which disproportionately award child custody to mothers and extract money disproportionately from fathers. I mean, I know guys who didn't see their sons between ages 10 and 15 because their wives just wouldn't comply with the arrangement after divorce, and no one's making anyone do anything. um, right? And that's a pretty critical age for a boy to have a father figure, both to set an example, for discipline, for boundaries, for guidance. And yet no, like it's completely invisible, right? They're like, oh, well, the mum's there, whatever. I'm like, yeah, okay. What's your point? You've now downplayed the father's interests and the child's interests, another male, um, for by elevating the interests of the woman. And those interests might just be, I want to get back at him because he whatever the history is. So
This
I
gets to that
definitely,
point about morally important, morally more important. But
yeah,
gynocentrism has a dimension to which the the life outcomes of boys are less morally important than the outcomes of girls. That the interests of men are morally less important than the interests of women. That's how it's corrosive. It's
yeah,
got that moral dimension to it, which most people intellectually say and express that men's health and women's health is both important, that boys' education and the girls' education is
mm,
both important. As a father of a son and a daughter, I feel that they are equally important and equally worthy of being optimized and served and effectively delivered. But what this draws out is that from a outcomes perspective, that's not the case. It's clearly significantly different in the asymmetry.
yeah. Now I'll give you another example from my life. I know someone, and we were having a conversation about our children and what they're doing after high school. And they casually, flippantly said to me, and they're a little bit older than me, they're probably mid 50s, um, what this son was doing after high school. And they said, oh, whatever he's doing, or he's working gap year, whatever. And they said to me just casually, but he's a white man now, so he'll be fine whatever he does. And I just thought, what? Wow, where did that come from? Like, he's your son, and you still think that he's on this fast track. He can be a bumbling Homer Simpson idiot and get a union job and raise a family. Like, how can you perceive that is the current reality still in the 2020s? Um, I thought, well, statistically, your daughter's more likely to go to university and succeed. Your son's more likely to kill himself right? And die in an accident and die at work. And I just thought, wow, it's somehow this moral preference is also linked to this historical advantage. And it just, I mean, it was a flippant remark a few
Mm.
years ago, but it's stuck with me. And it's very representative of what you're saying.
So there are some people who will cling to those beliefs until their dying day. They will cling to identity politics. They'll cling to intersectionality. They'll cling to those strong views that were formed. Maybe they were formative. Maybe they were, impacted by their experience
Mm,
in their teens, in their 20s. They'll cling to those. I think the hope for us is that we can raise younger people in a more enlightened, less prejudiced, less ideological framing. I think that's challenging. To be honest, it's very challenging to conceive of how the schools and universities in Australia could be taken from where they are now to a sex neutral, boy positive and girl positive environment. It's very challenging when you've got 18% of primary school teachers being male.
yeah.
When you've got the cultures in those organisations reinforced by education systems and departments, curricula that's been changed, the textbooks and other materials that have been changed. This is a multi-decade um, rebalance towards healthy social outcomes.
Yeah. And I mean, I think I'm reasonably positive, given that I have two sons who have are in the traditional views returning cohort of young men. But let's get to the fourth horse woman, gaslighting. Now, this is very interesting. It says gaslighting is psychological manipulation that tries to convince someone that their reality is untrue. The victim may be caused to question the validity of their own thoughts, doubt their perception of reality, or dissociate from their memories. Grossly misleading information is used to confuse and cause uncertainty. It convinces men that their concerns are imaginary. Speak up about family law bias, and you're told you must hate women. Question the gender pay gap narrative, and you're accused of being sexist. Meanwhile, extreme activists claim that it's impossible to be sexist against males or racist against white people. Gaslighting erodes confidence and silences debate.
So
Where do you notice this the most? Let's highlight them.
here, I'll just give you a contrast. So that comment
Mm,
that you heard earlier about he's a white male, will be okay. One of the cohorts in the UK that is least likely to go into university is poor white boys. They don't have
mm,
privilege.
mm,
In fact, being a boy means that you're less likely to go on to university in both the UK and in Australia. So if you think about how that compares to intersectionality, where being a male is uniformly seen as a benefit, as a privilege, as something that helps you in your life, it's not. In many different cases, as you pointed out, men in the United States are 4 times more likely to commit suicide. That's a big difference. In Australia, for example, male suicide rose last year by 5%, but female suicide dropped by 2%. So the hundreds of millions of dollars that we're spending on suicide prevention, it did see a small reduction in female suicide, but there were over an extra 100 boys and men who committed suicide last year compared to the year before. So it's actually getting a lot worse. And gaslighting is insidious. It it's sometimes it's challenging to call it out. You're going against the flow of often powerful public narratives, discourse, media, politicians, and thought leaders. And it takes time to understand some of these really complex phenomena. You
mm.
know, I went down that rabbit hole for 6 months, and there's plenty that I don't understand. So it's a very challenging one to get your head around. I just would point out that the Substack for celebrating masculinity does have an excerpt of my book, which includes the four horsewomen. So for anyone out there who would like to go back and have a close look at what these four are, if you search for Substack celebrating masculinity, It's the article that's most recently been released on the homepage. So you can dig into that and have a look at this part of chapter three if that's something you're keen to understand in more detail.
Great. I'll put a link up to that in the show notes. I want to get onto your solutions chapter,
Mm.
things that could change. Don't know how to get that sort of change, but the focus for change. But before I do, I guess I want to just ask you about hypocrisy for a moment. Um, you mentioned when we spoke the other day that a lot of people who keep um, the war on masculinity alive in their work environment or in their politics, in their household and their family, they very much do the opposite and they take traditional roles. And I noticed this too. Like, as you mentioned before, all those white women talking about racial diversity as a group, right? And there's a classic meme of all the white women getting together saying, I'm not racist, this and that. And all the blokes, with all the different race mates just hanging out. And they're saying, like, oh, what's racism? Because they just, they're blokes at work hanging out or whatever. Is do you notice now more hypocrisy on this thing? And if so, do you think that's a useful avenue for redirecting and pointing out reality to people whose status is tied to keeping the war on masculinity going? Or do you think it might backfire, starting with the hypocrisy?
This came up in the recent Adelaide Writers' Week incident,
Mm-hmm.
where there were claims of free speech and platforming all perspectives. And some of those people had been doing the cancelling just a couple of years ago,
Ah,
cancelling ideological, political opponents, inconvenient truths from different perspectives. So
uh-huh.
it's a dangerous game to play these days because there's a lot of information out there. A lot of it can be searched and analyzed. It's a very dangerous game to be playing. To be honest, really despise performative leaders,
Mm,
whether they're politicians or CEOs or others, people in positions of power. Um, I mentioned Jacob Savage calling out older men. Um, I think it's a really dangerous moral, intellectual um, strategy or approach to take.
mm,
And, um, I've seen some really brave, intellectually honest women standing up for boys and men. I call out Lisa Britton in my book, and I love a lot of her writing for Evie magazine and her tweets as well. Really brave. And, you know, what really emboldened me to write this book, Cameron, over the last 3 or 4 years, I've had hundreds of conversations with men and women, coffee chats and catching up with mums and dads and talking about their kids and school and what they aspire for their sons and their daughters. And what I noticed was there was this consistent big gap between what those men and women would say one on one over a coffee and what they weren't willing to say on stage or with a
mm,
microphone or to put onto social media. Konstantin Kisin made this point about sort of the health of society you can gauge by that gap, that dissonance. If there's a huge difference between what people privately say about their feelings and thoughts compared to what is in the public discourse, then there's a big problem.
mm,
And what it drives is culture and institutions becoming unbalanced. And I think Helen Andrews was very brave, to put the great feminization on the record. I've seen speeches from her prior to that, and she was going along these lines anyway. But that compact essay is phenomenal. It obviously was one of the biggest articles released during 2025, and she really closed that gap up. What she was sort of writing and vocalizing was what millions of people were already thinking and feeling, but they were too scared, and they lacked the courage to say that publicly. But I was hearing and being exposed to the same things. And after having hundreds of conversations, I figured I was so confident that most people genuinely believed this and genuinely felt this. It's just they weren't brave enough to say that publicly. And I felt that obligation because I was in a position where I could say some controversial and provocative things. I could test, um, and push the boundaries a little bit because I wasn't vulnerable in the same way that many men and some women are vulnerable to being cancelled or to being shut down.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you did, David, and I think again we're like-minded on that. Like, if you can't say it in public, where's your courage in your beliefs? Like, are you just going along to get along, or do you actually believe this? And I think men and women are different in that respect as well, by the way,
Mm,
which is part of, I think, Helen's essay on the culture of women. Men actually will stand up and say that's a terrible way to do this, whereas women want to keep the peace and make sure everyone's happy, regardless of whether the task is achieved successfully or not. And I even have conversations with my wife, and she's like, no, 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 the important thing is that we're all feeling good, not that the task is done. And I recognize that actually, so your job is to look after everyone's feelings. My job is actually to get tasks done. Right, I see. We're actually different. I don't treat you like a man whose objective is to get a task done, not to make people feel good. Um, and and it's almost like watching her recognize that, yeah, I want to be treated differently because I have different priorities, and I want you to be different. And and I'm just like, wow, okay, so we're really different. That's important.
mm.
What about the whole of society? Are we representative of men and women? I suspect we are. Anyway, solutions. Your solutions and reforms chapter focuses to me on education, health, priorities, and sort of, I guess you'd call it marriage, family, and culture.
Yeah,
So if
relationships and culture
relationships,
change. Yeah.
what, if, in the US, there's a big change happening. Trump has enabled change. There's a new health department, there's a new food pyramid, there's new priorities in the health administration in the US, right? For example, if you had the opportunity in Australia to sort of reset the agenda in the health system, firstly, and then education, where would you start?
I talk about tailoring health services to the preferences and needs of male patients and beneficiaries and co-designing. So deeply listening, understanding the perspective of men, why they're reluctant, to be engaged in talking therapies, to speak about very personal issues, maybe to a female GP. So tailoring the delivery of those services. I think there are some quite enlightened politicians and executives and bureaucrats who understand that. But we
Mm-hmm.
need that to be driven, obviously, from the top because it needs the political will to embolden, those bureaucrats and public servants and administrators so that they understand how important this is, that we're not currently meeting the needs of male patients, that we're not delivering services that are accessible or that are fit for purpose for
Mm-hmm.
how they feel comfortable engaging. We have done that for women to a much greater extent. And you see it in the effectiveness of treatments, for example, breast cancer. Prostate cancer diagnostics are quite weak, and the prostate cancer treatments are quite weak and less effective. And
Mm-hmm.
so quite a lot of work needs to be done there. There are some prickly areas of funding that do need to be looked at from an objective perspective. For example, medical research funding over the last decade for women's health has been 5.4 times higher than for men's health. And when I see males react to that, they are shocked. They don't realize just how imbalanced institutions have become. So those would be two areas I would really call out in terms of health delivery that can have a big, significant social dividend.
Yeah, brilliant. I think we might have to wrap it up, David. Being a man, I've got my Bunnings delivery arriving and about to make a lot of noise, and I'm going to go and do manly, masculine things that my wife would never in a million years even consider wanting to do. Where's the best place to find your work, David?
So, the Relentless War on Masculinity is available now. You can get it from Amazon, and you can also buy it in paperback, ebook, and listen to the audiobook. It's available very widely. So, if you search for The Relentless War on Masculinity, David Maywald, you'll be able to find it. And please have a look at Celebrating Masculinity as well, which is on Substack and Facebook and on X.
Terrific. I'll put as many links as I can in the show notes. David, I appreciate your time, and I hope we can get a little bit more balance in our culture, health, and education in the coming years. Thanks so much.